everybody, and welcome to the second Teseus colloquium. Today is focused on the topic of automation of welfare infrastructure in Europe. The seminar today is hosted given that this topic, the seminar today is hosted at the Department of Automatic Informatics and moderated by myself. I'm Antonio Vetro. I teach ethics and data protection here at Politecnico, and I'm a researcher of this department. And I'm really honored to introduce you to Doris Allhutter, our guest. Doris is a senior scientist at the Institute of Technology Assessment of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, where she leads the Austrian team, part of an international comparative study on automating welfare in Europe. That is exactly the topic of today's seminar. Doris Allhutter is a political scientist. Her main research focuses on investigating the normativity that is embedded in computing practices, especially in machine learning and artificial intelligence, when used in automated decision making for public policy purposes, such as the one that we will discuss in a few minutes. Doris, throughout all her career, successfully engaged with technical communities to pursue such a goal. For instance, I can mention that she co-authored the 2 editions of a workshop held at the International Conference on Requirements Engineering. The workshop was called Critical Requirements Engineering, where she dialogued with software engineers on the politics, power, values, and responsibilities that are embedded in the practices of software requirements engineering. Doris has been also a visiting researcher at several universities and research institutes across Europe and North America, including, for instance, UC Berkeley or the University of Toronto. And we are really thankful to Doris to having accepted our invitation to hold this second public seminar of Teseus, which I remind you is the new Center on Technology, Society and Humanity at the Politecnico. My introduction stops here. It's now time to leave the stage to Doris. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Antonio, for this kind introduction. Thank you, Stefano, for inviting me here to the Teseus Center. I think, given the case that I'm going to make today, it is so important to have interdisciplinary centers that can sort of establish a cooperation between technology studies and social sciences and humanities. And so in this respect, it's really a big honor to me to be one of the first speakers in your colloquium. I think, in fact, I'm really convinced that every technical university should have a center like this. So today I will talk about the transformation of welfare through the introduction of automated decision-making in the welfare sector. We have seen that across Europe, the welfare sector has been facing shrinking resources in the past 20 years. There is sort of this idea that public administration should work more efficiently and that welfare benefits should be distributed in an effective way, so that it gets to the people that need welfare benefits. As a response, we can see that policymakers and public administration in many countries turn to automated decision-making and data-driven welfare provision. So there is, in fact, this vision that welfare can be radically transformed by automation and by enhancement with artificial intelligence and machine learning. Emerging ADM systems perform many functions in society, as you of course know. Some of them are perceived as rather unproblematic and beneficial to citizens, but others have the capacity to disrupt living circumstances. And so this is what my talk looks like today. I will start with a specific case of automated decision making. In various countries across Europe, we have seen that public employment services has been one of the main domains that attempt making use of data or of the knowledge that we find in data. And I will talk about how that worked in Austria. And then I want to widen the scope to the automation of welfare across Europe and suggest a sort of analytical lens for asking how the future of welfare is being shaped in Europe. Okay, so like other European countries, Austria is trying to introduce a decision support system. This decision support system is supposed to predict employment prospects of job seekers. The system has become publicly known as the so-called AMS algorithm. AMS, you can see here on the slide, it stands for the Austrian Public Employment Agency. In more strict terms, the system is called AMAS. So this system is not in use yet. In fact, the Austrian Data Protection Agency made a complaint that there is no legal basis for such a system to be used. And right now, the decision whether it can be used or not lies with the Supreme Administrative Court and is still pending. When the public first learned about the system, it was heavily criticized in the media. As you can see from this little snippet here, for example, you have a deduction for being female. There are also care obligations on the bottom here lead to a deduction in the calculation of future chances on the labor market, but care obligations, for example, have only been considered for mothers and not for fathers in this system. What does the system actually do? Based on past statistics, job seekers are classified into groups by this system. AMAS looks for connections between job seekers' characteristics and successful employment, and it then classifies job seekers into these three categories. A group H with high chances to find a job within the coming 6 months. This group is expected to find work with additional training or job qualification. Then a group M with mediocre prospects. This group is offered job trainings and qualification measures. And a group L with low chances of employment within the next 2 years. And these clients get guidance, but no job trainings. And this decision assumes that they have other needs or other problems in life first, and that they could not actually gain from qualification measures. The overall objective of this AMAS system is to primarily invest into job seekers for whom additional training or support measures will most likely lead to a fast and sustainable reintegration into the labor market. So I guess this sort of sounds like a legitimate aim at first, but let's see in more detail what the algorithm actually aims to do. So the design of the profiling system was guided by 3 big aims. The first one was to increase the efficiency of the counseling process. That means that the time and resources used by caseworkers should be more targeted by differentiating the customers into these 3 groups. The second objective was to increase the effectiveness of labor market programs and the use of funds in this area. And the third goal was that the system is supposed to sort of standardize the granting of active labor market measures and to avoid arbitrariness. Basically, the Austrian Public Employment Agency claims that the system is just an additional source of information, that it is neutral and objective, and that any low score that a job seeker or maybe a particular group of job seekers may get just reflects the truth of discrimination on the labor market, the harsh reality out there, so to speak. However, we see that the functionality of the system is also connected to a political goal, which is the use of funding instruments should become more effective. And in particular, it should become more effective by savings or through savings on job seekers with high chances, through a focus on those with medium chances, and through outsourcing all customers with low chances. AMAS considers a number of person characteristics such as gender, age group, citizenship, education, health impairment, or care obligations, and you can see that those characteristics are very often binary or rather vague. It considers the occupational group, but it only differentiates between the production sector and the service sector. Then you can see there is a variable called regional labor market. This basically counts how many people are registered as unemployed in one particular RMS site and how many of them find employment. So we can see that in fact two neighboring districts of Vienna could have different values for a regional labor market, and it reflects on your own personal score that you get from the system, but clearly you could just like take the bus and go to the next district to find labor there, right? So all these variables, and then we have a number of variables that catch your case in terms of how long have you been unemployed, how often during a certain time, how many measures have you participated in, and so on. So all these variables together are then called a constellation. That's what the design team calls it. Important for the quality of the system is the data that it relies on, of course. AMAS has different functionalities for job seekers with full data of the past 4 years and job seekers with limited data. The job seekers with limited data amount to 3 subgroups. These are the groups with a so-called migration background, then people under the age of 25, and then everybody else who has a limited data of the past 4 years. There is no explanation as to why it makes sense to differentiate between people who have limited data because they have a migration background or have limited data for other reasons. Migration background, by the way, also means or you have a migration background if one of your parents doesn't have the Austrian citizenship. So if you happen to be under 25 and have one parent with a different than Austrian citizenship, then you belong to the group with a migration background first and not to the group of people under the age of 25. The RMS highlights high precision rates of the system, but in fact precision rates are only known for some of the segments in the system. For other segments, precision rates are frequently between 80 and 85%, which means that out of approximately 400,000 people who are in the care of the Public Employment Agency every year, there is approximately 120,000 people with wrong results every year. And it is important to mention that error rates are not distributed equally across those subpopulations. So what I want to do now is to have a closer look at the biases that we find in the system. Starting with a technical bias here on this slide, technical bias occurs due to simplification, due to technical assumptions or limitations. In this system AMAS, technical bias is largely due to the modeling of variables, for example, by setting apart the thresholds, for example, in the variable age category. We can see here that two people at the ages of 30 and 49 are supposed to have more similar integration values than two people with 29 and 30 years old. Then we see a standardization of rather fuzzy variables, for example, health impairment. You only have two characteristics, you either have yes or no without giving it any context or saying something about the relevance of this impairment for the actual profession that you want to have. Then another example would be occupational group, where you only have a production and service, which assumes then that, for example, a programmer would have equal job chances as a waiter, since they are both in the service sector. Another thing we find as a technical bias is the exclusion of some very important aspects, such as motivation or appearance, that are important factors in finding a job. So on the one hand, you have the idea that things can be easily expressed in numerical terms, whereas other things can't. So something complicated as health impairment just is done with a yes or no, but motivation cannot be factored into the system, was the idea. The idea of classifying people based on constellations, and remember, a constellation is the whole set of person characteristics that come together. So this idea basically assumes that there is a homogeneity of chances within one constellation, and this assumption is very problematic. The question is now, what can be done about that technically? Do we maybe just need more fine-grained constellations? And here we must say that unfortunately a stronger differentiation of variables is not a solution, because it increases the number of constellations, but then we do have too low statistical significance. The system as it is now already has constellations with very few observations. The developers actually state that having 50 people in one constellation is statistically satisfactory. But even this requirement is not fulfilled for 39% of all unemployed people in the system. Another technical bias that we found in the system is the distribution of error rates. Error rates vary in subpopulations and constellations, and groups that are systematically disadvantaged by higher error rates are typically minorities. We know that from critical data studies. In AMAS, we also find emergent bias. This is a bias which arises over time. AMAS assumes that future events can be predicted using data from the past. However, we know that regular changes in the labor market are rather the norm than the exception, and that of course also social values change over time. So, for example, when we think of changing economies, there are extraordinary events such as the recession in 2008 or the COVID-19 crisis, but there is also less disruptive changes like legislative changes or local changes, for example, the bankruptcy of a larger company in a region that might have a big impact on chances of employment in that region. A third type of bias is pre-existing bias. This pre-existing bias usually is deeply steeped in society And history, for example, the gender bias that attributes care obligations to women but not to men, despite of whether either of them actually does have those care obligations or not. Since AMAS is based on past data, it reflects the inequalities on the labor market and also the structural unequal treatment on the labor market. And these are historically long-lasting inequalities, for example, affecting women in technical occupations or people with a migration background. So this does result then in a cumulative disadvantage, and marginalized groups therefore systematically get lower integration values from the system. Due to the strong focus on person characteristics, we, for example, find that women at the beginning of unemployment find themselves in the low segment twice as often as men. We also see differences in subpopulations. For example, at the beginning of unemployment, people with incomplete data are almost twice as often in the low segment as people with full data. And this again has an impact on the subpopulation with a migration background. We also see proxy variables in the system. For example, I mentioned in the beginning the variable regional labor market. This correlates strongly with social class, and the idea of the developers was to sort of factor in a sort of problem pressure of a region or a district. So social class clearly was an idea that was part of framing or of thinking about this variable regional labor market. Pre-existing bias occurs in the system through cumulative disadvantage on the labor market, and then potentially causes feedback loops. So this is what the system, the dynamics within the system look like. So what actually happens in practice. The agency, in fact, describes the computer value as a second opinion, which is supposed to assist caseworkers. However, the focus of client contact when using the system clearly shifts from an individual person's support needs to labor market opportunities based on population statistics. To all of you who would appreciate, in fact, a modernization of public administration, this might also be a little disappointing, because this is what it actually looks like. So it is an interface with a sort of 80s charm, probably. I won't. It's in German. I'm sorry for that. I won't go into the details, but just to show you what we're dealing with here. So anyway, this clearly changes the work practices of counselors towards handling a series of tasks required by the system. Explaining or maybe negotiating a client's classification, or also a possible reclassification of a client, requires more time and more commitment than simply just taking over the calculated value. Given the short counseling time per job seeker and the system's incentives also to accept the computer value, it is very likely that the caseworker will routinely treat this computer score as the first opinion, and it is very likely to overrule their own experience and counseling. To distract public concerns about that, the job agency claims that the system is neutral, that it is objective, that it is of high quality, but at the same time it emphasizes the idea of the second opinion and the role of the caseworker to act as what they call a social corrective. So if the system makes a mistake, the caseworker has the last decision and is to be a social corrective. For job seekers, the focus on the classification means that their biography and skills are reduced to this seemingly objective value that provides information about their chances on the labor market. The choice of variables focuses on personal characteristics of the job seekers, remember? So in this way, we can see that unemployment is sort of framed in terms of the employability of an individualized job seeker. And the system does not indicate if a job seeker's low chances are, for example, due to the economic situation, due to discrimination on the labor market, or due to the shortcomings of the client, him or herself. And for both, for caseworkers and clients, these inscribed biases are absolutely non-transparent, because in fact they get a number and they get a high, medium or low evaluation, and they get 2 sentences of explanation that refer to the client, him or herself, and as I said, not to the economic situation or anything else that might have an impact on employment chances. So after criticism was becoming loud that the system does not include the labor market situation, a so-called business cycle factor was introduced. However, this business cycle factor does not include direct data on economic development. Indeed, it is generated by comparing the aggregate integration chances of different years to then forecast the development of the subsequent years. So, of course, this procedure is a little questionable, because it assumes that purely empirical observation of integration chances provides reliable information on economic trends. And it entails the risk of perpetuating inaccurate assumptions in the system instead of introducing or instead of conducting a genuine correction of integration chances by comparing them with external economic data. Much can be, of course, said about the needs for transparency, about the need for independent oversight or of democratic and legal implications of such a system. But I want to, in fact, take a step back and first see if AMAS actually meets the goals of the Public Employment Agency. And you remember I told you the 3 aims that the Employment Agency was going for in the beginning. And we can in fact see that an increase in the efficiency of the counseling process can only be reached with a predominantly routine adoption of the computer-generated classification. This, I suggest, counteracts the service orientation of an institution that is supposed to fulfill its public mandate to increase the chances of job seekers. Second aim was to increase the training effectiveness. Training effectiveness is supposed to be increased by concentrating the funding in the middle segment, but this, in our analysis showed, does not aim at the accuracy or quality of an active labor market measure for a particular client, but it combines the goal of the effective use of resources with a very coarse division into these 3 customer groups. And then the third goal was the standardization of the process to reduce arbitrariness. And here we can see that in the development of the system, hardly any procedures were used to avoid bias, that the system in fact does not offer any assistance with preventing possible structural unequal treatment. And it is important to me to mention that traditionally equal treatment policies have played a big role in the job agency's practice. And so this means that there is a big risk that this practice will be undermined or overruled by an objectified classification of job seekers. Now, the AMS algorithm might seem like a peculiar national case, we could say, but we see that in many countries across Europe, similar systems have been introduced. Some of them share some of the problems that I have mentioned, others have different objectives. But we see that the idea of using data analytics for predicting job chances with whatever political goal behind is widespread across Europe. So what can the example of automated decision making in public employment agencies actually show us? In the initial focus, so to speak, of what we often analyze is mostly the systems themselves. At least that's something that we do in technology assessment and in science and technology studies. So we look at the guiding principles that inform the technical design of a system, the data that it is based on, the error rates, the results for different groups and people. But this is, as you could see from my presentation of the system, it is entangled with how the counseling process is being shaped and changed. It is connected to the objectives that the system pursues on an operational level, with the effects it has on the interaction between caseworkers and citizens, and the impacts it has on individual job seekers. Then these dynamics are related to the agency as a whole, to the objectives that the system pursues on an organizational level. It is relevant for the organizational culture and practices and how these are being transformed. It is relevant for how the role of the caseworker is perceived, and therefore the way in which public policy addresses the citizen. And then let's not forget, it also has an impact on the caseworkers, right? So we could also ask then, how is adopting the system linked, for example, to the supervision of caseworkers and to the agency's performance indicators? That would be a natural next step to maybe pursue with such a system. And then obviously such a system is to support the government's labor market policies. So we need to ask, what is the relation between the profiling of job seekers and labor market policies? Taking this multi-layered entanglement into account then points to the bigger picture, namely the question of the wider welfare system that this is part of. And we can ask, how does automated decision-making in the public sector actually contribute to a transformation of welfare systems? And I'm not speaking of a like intended transformation here, but that there are, I would say, dynamics on the loose that we are all not quite aware of. And this is where I come to the second part of my talk. So database infrastructures for public administrations are shaping welfare systems, are shaping how citizens encounter the state. So I suggest we need to explore the implementation of ADM systems in the welfare sector across Europe. The European Digital Decade Policy Program 2030 sets out concrete digital targets. One of them is the digitization of public services, and here the EU envisions a joint effort by all member states and at the union level. They even envision a novel governance system, including joint up investments. So I know that, of course, this has been on the political agenda for a while. This is not new, but I see that they are creating new financial instruments and ways, governance systems, as they say, to actually go forward with this project. The 2030 Digital Compass suggests that a new way of building digital public services includes data processing, artificial intelligence, and virtual reality. And it says that Europe must harness digitalization to drive a paradigm change in how citizens, public administrations, and democratic institutions interact. So we see that the digital transformation should go hand in hand with improvements as regards democracy, good governance, social inclusion, and more efficient public services. And this is where this group of colleagues comes into play. In the next 3 years, we will be working together to assess the implications of this transformation for society, for civic agency, and human flourishing in Europe. This is where the positive picture comes into play now. So using a perspective of social justice and equality, we study two domains of automation. First, the automation of core welfare services, including social services such as employment services, healthcare, social benefits provision. But then we also have the idea of a more communal communal welfare infrastructures and services that can include, for example, smart city initiatives, which provide automated infrastructures for community building and urban development. EU communities are developing smart data platforms by integrating data across different sectors and cities. And they are supposed to improve the quality of everyday life. That is the idea. And these smart data platforms are supposed to play a key role in improving cities' resilience and building on their local strengths and opportunities. This is the idea, and we in the project want to have like a critical look on this development, but at the same time we also want to contribute in a positive way to whatever is to come there. Our comparative research design looks at 8 countries that represent different welfare models, and in the project we first map or ask how welfare is automated across Europe. We are in the process of doing that right now, and we ask how the introduction of ADM in welfare intersects with broader transformations of welfare across different welfare regimes. We want to zoom in on the relationship between citizens and the state. So how does this relationship between citizens and the state change? This might be a bit far-fetched first, but I want to give you a brief outlook into what this last question might actually imply. And for this, I want to once more come back to the previously discussed system, and I want to look at it from the perspective of a transformation of welfare. And this perspective shows us that the supposedly increased effectivity that they are aiming for, that this aim legitimizes a particular distribution of scarce resources. In Austria, only the middle group, as I have mentioned, is supposed to have access to traditional active labor market programs. Other countries, I want to stress, provide privileged support for job seekers with a high risk of long-term unemployment. And they have made systems that actually are supposed to detect risks of long-term unemployment in order to help quick instead of outsourcing this group. In fact, this means that we have to have a close look at these systems in light of the neoliberal shift in Europe's different social systems. During the past 20 years, under growing unemployment and austerity, social policies have been shifting towards activation regimes. They aim at mobilizing the citizens' self-responsibility and increasingly replace rights-based access to welfare. The activation paradigm follows an individualized approach that aims at changing the behavior, the motivations, or the competences of job seekers instead of actually taking structural measures against unemployment. So in this activation regime, the relation between the state and the citizen is based on a contract that customers actually really have to sign at the public employment agencies, and by which they then agree to fulfill certain obligations in order to obtain benefits. The primary responsibility of unemployment is, with this practice, shifted to the unemployed person that has to be activated in the counseling process and through active labor market programs. So what does it mean to then introduce a system like the one I have presented in line with this activation paradigm? The IMS algorithm does have a strong tendency to individualize causes of unemployment. This objectified algorithmic score frames unemployment mostly in terms of their individualized employability, as I've mentioned. So the system is based on variables that represent their presumed structural discrimination on the labor market. That means also that employability is thought of in terms of a discrimination risk rather than in terms of skills and competences that need to be developed. So how does that then go together with activation policies, I want to ask? Since the system strongly focuses on those person characteristics, it basically conceptualizes employability as something that is innate to the individual and that is stable over time and context. And this carries a strong potential for stigmatization of particular groups and, in fact, the limited agency of job seekers to change or to impact their score then contradicts the idea of an autonomous, enterprising individual that has control over their success on the labor market. I have used the notion of infrastructure several times in my talk, and I just want to spend a minute on saying something about that. The notion of infrastructure implies that maybe implies something that is standardized across Europe, or at least something that will stick with us for a long time. But what is this kind of infrastructure that is actually being envisioned? When we think of infrastructure, we usually have images like this in our mind, right? It's wires, rail tracks, networks, and so on. But my question is, how can we foreground that the sort of social fabric an infrastructure is built from and the social relation that it then brings about? And science and technology studies offer something very neat to work with there. They propose a relational concept of infrastructure, saying infrastructure is a contextual relation rather than a thing. Infrastructure relates to the people who design, maintain, and use it. It is embedded, it is sunk inside of other structures and social arrangements. And a number of significant political, ethical, and social choices are without doubt folded into the development of infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructures of welfare, we can ask what are its characteristics? Does it become infrastructure just because it's being datafied or because this datafication has a vital role in the functioning of our society? If we think of infrastructure, of a more traditional notion of infrastructure as in critical infrastructures, for example, this refers to infrastructure in terms of our social and material systems of supply and care, to systems that are in place to cover our basic needs and that therefore have a role in the flourishing of people and society. So I suggest that this relational concept of infrastructure actually helps us see that the performativity of this idea of data-driven welfare provision, so the way that it co-produces social and political practices. And this can help to analytically make visible some things that are interesting on the more socio-technical level rather than the technical level as something that is distinct from what happens in society. So in light of the rather ambivalent nature of cases that we have seen across Europe, our project aims to advance a conceptual and empirical research on ADMs in welfare provision. We want to develop a comparative baseline for automating welfare across Europe, and also a theoretical contribution to conceptualize automation of welfare for the benefit of people. In addition to these goals, to these research outputs, we see our impact in identifying best and worst practice examples. We want to make recommendations for the design of algorithmic tools that take the perspectives of citizens seriously. So we also want to work with designers on like building skills for doing better stuff. And we want to develop guidelines for policymakers to have a sort of idea of what to look out for, and to set up processes in which we can actually work together in a way that is beneficial to society and to social welfare. So, and this is why I'm also particularly happy to be here today. I come from an institute of technology assessment. Technology assessment is a field that also has a mission of working with policymakers, of giving advice to the Austrian Parliament. We are also in a network of European parliamentary technology assessment. So I want to close by saying that I'm also very interested in learning about what TESAS does in order to establish this relationship and the ways of working with policymakers. What could be imagined there? What is your experiences in that? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Doris, for this talk. I will be happy to take questions now from the audience. And let me start to warm up this Q&A session. From a software engineering perspective, this is mine. It is quite clear that there are certain design flaws in how the system has been, the AMS system has been built and implemented. From a social technical perspective, though, it seems that these design flaws are, how to say, are a kind of effect of a higher problem, let's say, that resides, in my opinion, in the political goals that has been set before the technical implementation. I mean, the STEM system probably could have been much more successful if the good political goal would have been to make not a clear distinction between job seekers, but maybe to match in a better way demand of work and the offer of work. And similarly, in another, let's say, bad experience in Europe that we had in the welfare, that is the child welfare fraud system in the Netherlands, where the Prime Minister resigned after that scandal. Similarly, also there, the political goal of the system was to find the frauds, not to find the people that could have had a better access to the welfare. Do you think that changing the political goals will result also in better technical systems?
I think it's an egg and hen problem, in fact, because I mean you could like make a classification or profiling of people, and then you could use it for these or these purposes, right? And I don't even know was it the political aim to only go for the middle segment? Was that the first idea and then came the classification? Or did the possibility of classifying, of profiling people actually then put the idea of centralizing resources in the middle segment in place? So I would agree with you that there might be different needs of different people, and that we could have a segmented offer, right? Not everybody, even low chances, high chances, whatever. There are reasons why you want training or why you don't want training, when it makes sense and when it doesn't make sense, but we can ask the people. And if we have a segmented offer, I think I'd appreciate that, but segmenting people cannot be the way. And I think you can see that you can differentiate that from the political goal. So that's maybe two different things, but just changing the goal or doing it for different reasons doesn't make the profiling any better or any more accurate.
Yeah, thanks. Any other question?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Because here at the Politecnico University of Torino, with the research group coordinated by Professor Sacchi, we worked with a similar topic, digitalization in public employment services across Europe. And indeed, Austria was a case study, very interesting. So we already know something about that, but there are several questions. First of all, you said that motivation is an important predictor of labor market performance. What's your opinion about survey data? Because, as you may know, in the Netherlands there is a famous profiling system which deal with a very advanced system of get that kind of information from surveys. So maybe another kind of segmentation, your opinion on something else. And you said that there is a limited space for the case workers dealing with the EMAT system. So did you find some kind of manipulation from the side of case workers in order to adapt, let's say, the infrastructure with the social goals that they need to provide? And concerning the study of the database system from Flanders in our research, we find that there is an even more advanced system from the side of algorithmic decision making, but there was a kind of acceptance from the social citizenship. So interviewing people like you that worked with that system, they said that there was an important process from the managerial side of the story. So in order to elaborate a system working with universities, so is there a possibility to make the difference with that? And the very last question, if I may, I was wondering about the empirical strategy concerning the next further steps of the interesting research that you provide in the last section of the presentation. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, so I think the first question about motivation and using survey data, I think my point was less that the system would be better if we included motivation. My point was to say that some things are being objectified in the system and seem measurable, just such as health impairment, and they seem to speak for themselves, whereas other things seem to be unmeasurable, and it is to be questioned. With using the example of motivation that is not in the system, I was actually questioning the way that the things that are supposed to be measurable, is that done in the right way, and is that really measurable so easy in a binary variable, right? As to the agency of caseworkers, we don't have experiences in Austria yet what caseworkers will do with the system, because you need to imagine this has been a process that has been going on since 2008, when the first ideas about the systems came up. Depending on which government was in place, they stopped the development and then picked it up again with the next government. So that was an on and off process. It was not an easy process. It was it was like years and years of meetings between the public agency and the developers. So there are like piles and piles of minutes of those meetings. It was really a big process. Even more shocking that was the outcome, probably. We know shortly before the corona crisis, the system was to be put into action, but then corona hit, and the integration chances were already visible in the system, but caseworkers were told not to use them. So whether they actually do use them or not, some might use them, some might not. By court, by the current state of affairs in court, caseworkers are not supposed to use the score, but we know that it is visible. There is a digital rights organization in Austria called Epicenter Works, and they have been campaigning against the system, and they have been touring through the country to inform unemployed people in front of IMS sites, and they told us that in fact managers of the public agencies are coming to talk to them, expressing that they are not happy about the system, and that they feel that it isn't of any help to them. So I think, is there gonna be action against it? There might be, but my concern is more a generational concern, so to speak. Right now in the job services, you have people that come with the experience and with the attitude and motivation of social workers. And if you alter the training of these people, you rather train them on the system than training them to be social workers, that will mean that people will question the system less. So we are still to see the outcome of that. I don't know how the case will go in front of court, but I believe that even if they have to stop the project, that it will be picked up in some sort of way again, in a different form or shape, I guess. So could there be a design process that is better suited? Yes, sure, obviously. I think there are ideas of participatory design, of asking what caseworkers actually really need, what would assist them in their work, that is important. I think that also asking job seekers is important. In Austria, we have a very paternalistic attitude in the employment services towards job seekers, that assumes that they don't know what they need, they don't want to, and we have to tell them what to do, or the computer even has to tell them what to do. But I think that people can contribute to saying what they think would help them. How can they be informed, for example, about a segmented offer of the public agency in order to benefit from what is available, for example. Now remind me of your fourth question.
The empirical strategy of the next research.
Okay. Well, right now we are looking for cases in the 8 countries that we are researching, and there are many cases that look small to start with, so where we don't know yet which dimension is behind them, and we are trying to coordinate the policy fields that we are looking at. In most countries, we have systems in the public employment agencies that could be some sort of where we do have the opportunity to compare. There are many systems popping up in the healthcare sector, for example, trying to coordinate personal capacities in the healthcare sector. There are ideas about using it in education in terms of seeing in which teachers we need in which school forms. This comes with a very disparate data that is not centralized in the federal government, but that is in the provinces. So we have problems of like integrating that data and knowing which teachers we actually lack in which forms of school. So there are very different ideas. Our step in this moment is actually to map the landscape and to see where can we have a comparative baseline across the countries.
I also have a couple of questions. I'll try to keep it under 4. The first one is about liability. So I have an understanding that it's an ongoing issue about the agency of the social workers, but currently, do they have to share the score with some supervisory authority? Let's say they know the categorization provided by the system, but do they have to share their knowledge of this category when they proceed working on that particular case with their supervisors or even with the person themselves? The second is more about the fact that, well, in this neoliberal age that you mentioned that we are living in, on the current discussion on the extension or the shrinking of the welfare state, does this feel like an extension of the welfare state, or does it feel like a shrinking under the guise of efficiency? And about the political organization of the people that are going to get categorized. Like, so far we managed to categorize because we know which group we belong to, and we know other people that belong to the same group. And so we can come to some form of political organization, but how will these people organize themselves? Do they have access to the people in the group? Like, what is the approach of that? Thank you.
I'm not sure if I got that last question, but let me start with that. Is there some organizing of the groups that are concerned, of the protected groups you're talking?
No, it's not just about the protected groups. It's about the fact that up to this point, how do we organize ourselves politically? We organize because I know that according to classical categories, I'm a girl. If I get discriminated, and there is, let's say, an instance of, in a simple case, a professor that discriminates against girls at Politecnico, then I know other people that belong to the same group, that have the same case, and therefore we can organize ourselves politically, so to speak, in a university scenario. In larger society, we know that we belong to a particular neighborhood, we know we belong to a particular social strata, whatever. In this particular case, the people that are in the low, let's say, categorization, first, do they know that they are in that particular category? Second, do they know other people that are in the same category in order to be able to organize?
Thank you. Now I understand. Yeah. So first of all, yes, caseworkers are supposed to tell the client which category they are in, and they're supposed to give them the 2 lines that the system spits out to explain why they are in that category. The lines that they get, the explanation, is very focused on the person itself and does not relate to other circumstances that might influence job prospects. And we see that caseworkers have a very limited understanding of what the system actually does, and they have like guidelines and sentences, basically like really sentences that they are supposed to say to clients, like tell them those 2 sentences, then tell them the system is objective, so I don't think these guidelines are really helpful to anyone. So it is very intransparent for the caseworker and for the client. And the problem is, of course, then what do you do with that information? There is nowhere to go, right? How do you argue that this is not correct if you don't know what it is made of? Then the caseworkers have guidelines on which grounds they can change the score or the categorization. So there is a list of reasons. For example, person is highly motivated, they have resolved their care obligations. Yeah? So they have like also again these sentences to enter into the system, and there are very clear guidelines what are reasons so that you can reclassify a person or not. Which makes me think that at some point it might be a problem for caseworkers to recategorize many people, because if the performance indicators of that particular IMS site doesn't match up to the performance of other IMS sites, they might look into why that is, and do the people not follow the system. But that is in the future. That is just something that I can imagine. We don't see any evidence of that yet, since the system is not really in use, right? Is there a way of organizing? In fact, in the case of the Netherlands has shown that it is very hard, because it's not only intransparent how your own score came together, but who do you share your problems with, so to speak. And with the fraud detection in the Netherlands, I heard from the NGO that took over that case that people did not know why they were blamed of fraud. In fact, when they asked for information, they got folders and papers with that were blacklined, and they couldn't get any information out of that. So the first incident of realizing what was happening is when they met in a room and when they saw who else was there. And then they saw it was particular living areas that were targeted. Yeah. And then does it shrink or extend the welfare state? Well, I think that you cannot say that in a generalizing way. You really need to have a look into the different policy areas and the dynamics there.
Thank you for your little talk. I am Sid Reynal from University of Paris. I've got a question that might be slightly off the track, it's so to say beyond data. Well, I don't know to what extent you could interact with these people like social workers. But talking about guidelines, recommendation, what is their stance? Do they express any kind of consciousness of the fact that the supposed objectivity of the kind of system is just a lure? Mm-hmm. And how do they very generally express a kind of general view on automation and the fact not only they might lose their job, but they might change their job themselves, not just become on the other side job seeker themselves, maybe?
I think many caseworkers are very critical about the system. They see that the way of working with the system it's counterintuitive to what they learned and counterintuitive to the experiences that they have gained in their counseling practice. We see in other countries, for example, in Poland, that there was that caseworkers use subversive practices to not follow a computer score and to actually sabotage the system. And it was then also taken off again by court in the end. So I think there is space for subversion, and I think that in this project on the IMS algorithm, we actually looked at the system itself, because it was already very hard to figure out the technical specification of the system, to get information about that. But in this project, we do have a people-centered approach. We talk to citizens, we talk to people who are subject to this kind of profiling practices, or people in general. How do they envision the future welfare state? We talk to designers, still figuring out the systems is a big part of it though. But in this project we really have 3 years to take different angles, and that's a good thing.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Anna, and thank you for your talk. It's really interesting to discuss these topics here in Politecnico. I've started my PhD in political science in November, and I have 3 questions. The first concerns the very adoption of algorithms. Like, I was wondering who decided in the case of Austria to introduce algorithms. So was it framed as a neutral and technical decision from its beginning, or did it need some sort of political discussion or legitimization? The second question concerns accountability. So, in case algorithms lead to discrimination, who has to be accountable, like the programmer, the manager, the operator? And are there mechanisms to evaluate discriminatory outcomes? And the third is about performance indicators, as my PhD will be on this topic. So I wanted to ask you how they should be used and how they should be built in order to avoid discriminatory outcomes and maybe proactively push for inclusive employment policies. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I decided for the adoption of algorithms. Well, I mean, first, one thing that I can say that the idea of raising efficiency and effectivity was there from the start. So that is the guiding frame under which this whole project developed. Then later on, the idea was also caseworkers might discriminate or might be biased, and so we need to we need some sort of database or evidence-based decision making there in order to do away with that arbitrariness. But we see that that was never really an aim. That was something that was added on to legitimize the system later. Really, it was about effectiveness of public management and efficiency of active labor market programs. But of course, the way you frame efficiency is questionable in that case. I can't tell whose idea it was. We just know that the idea of using data analytics has been growing all over the place, and the European Union's trajectory or goal is also to use what we have to modernize public administration, right? So I think the process some sort of started in a way that people looked at what data do we have, what can we do with it? And then I feel it depends on who you talk to. Which data is there, what data can you make use of, and how can you make it work for the agency? The accountability, yeah, we don't have accountability right now. I mean, we have the Artificial Intelligence Act by the European Union coming up soon, which will mean that the nation states will have to implement some kind of institutional or legal framework for systems like that to be used. So many countries do now have data protection agencies, and I'm sure that in the near future we will have to start talking about how what can an institution look like that deals with bias and discrimination in data analytics. Will that be part of data protection? Will that be a separate thing? It for sure needs expertise in equality and discrimination. So a different set of skills is needed here in order to create mechanisms to keep that whole development in check. And performance indicators, I would say you can't make a general statement about that. You really need to be very context specific. And that is a problem that maybe needs to be communicated to policymakers in some sort of suitable way, because we see when we had the public bid for this Austrian system, they said we want an accuracy rate of about 80%. Yeah, but then nobody ever said what accuracy was or are there other performance measures and what does that actually mean. So I think we need to have guidelines for policy makers also to about performance measures, but also not to like set general standards, but to make clear that performance is very context specific. When you look at the 3 goals that this system had, you can already see a big heterogeneity of goals there. So raising the effectiveness of a work process, raising the efficiency of active labor market programs, and standardizing the process and avoiding arbitrariness are 3 goals that maybe need very different measures. In particular, when you want to like optimize it in a sort of system like that. And that was really, none of the goals actually has been fulfilled.
Any other questions, comments?
Mine is just a curiosity. Do you use narratives in your research technique to help people figure out how the future would be if such a system was applied? And do you have stories, actual or also fictional, about what would be if someone finished in the false negative situation or in the false positive? So, yeah, because I would like to better figure out the future that you imagine, no? Yourself.
Well, methodically, we have 2 things in the project, how we want to work with citizens. One thing is in cases where systems might already be in place and people actually do already have first experiences in dealing with those systems. And in that case, we do use narratives, but the narratives are based on the experiences of actual citizens. This method that we're using works with their memories of using such a system, and they then write the text of how it was for them to use that system. And it is a collective method that uses those memories in order to find shared patterns of meaning making in those narratives, right? And a memory might be individual, but if you have a group of 20 people write about the same system, you can find some patterns that are repeated. For example, how do they feel about their agency using the system? That is something that you cannot like directly ask them, right? But working with their memories in a text form makes it very accessible to tease that out. And then there are cases where systems are not in use yet, but when they are in the making, so to speak. And in that case, we will do vision workshops with citizens, create ideas with them about how they can imagine the future. Maybe we have not designed that yet, but we will use a mix of vision workshops and speculative design approaches to get from the bigger vision of what we want in the future to how can that actually be implemented in more detail. You had a second question.
Yeah, the second is about the second was about false positiveness and false negativeness. Is it better to be considered L while you are H? Or is it better to be considered H while you are L?
Yeah, wrong is wrong. So I think, for example, an argument that the AMS made is the question is the system discriminating against women? Women get lower scores, so is it discriminatory? The AMS said no. In fact, most of the women land in the middle category, which means that they will have access to training and qualification. So this is not a discrimination. So I think we have to differentiate two things in the system. There is unequal treatment and there is discrimination. Clearly, when you are a woman and you have the same person characteristics as a man, but only the gender difference and maybe the difference in care obligation pushes you from a high score to an N score, means that you will be unequally treated, because you have to go to meetings more often, you have to talk about care obligations that you might have, whereas as a man, even if you have care obligations, you don't have to talk about it, or if they are relevant, then you have to actually make a case in that you need something that a person who has care obligations might need, like a part-time job, right? So it is unequal, and it might not be beneficial to a man or a woman. Question, does it result in a discrimination? Depends. Depends then if are you actually excluded from a measure that you need, and will that in the long run give you a disadvantage and contribute to that cumulative disadvantage that you start with, so to speak. So yeah, it's false positive or false negative, both both is the feeling, so to speak.
Then I'm not sure, insofar as, actually, I mean, you have profiling systems everywhere in Europe, and everywhere are they contested. So I'm not talking of ADM, but simply, I mean, profiling systems. And the point is, what is the outcome of the error, exactly? And you say, well, an error is an error, but at the same time, something you mentioned is that in many European systems, actually, I mean, categories, I mean, weaker categories get, higher intensity treatment. Mm-hmm. And so, in that case, I mean, being assigned to that category would be, something that is justifiable in Rawlsian terms, as it were. Okay? So, I mean, that is an error, that is something that, but still, I mean, you're erring on something that can be normatively believed to be beneficial.
Yeah.
Then you have conditionality, okay? And there is where I would say caseworkers' discretion, comes into play. But then I like, I mean, your idea of impact and trying to provide, guidance to policymakers. Then you also have to factor in, caseworkers' practices, mm-hmm. vis-a-vis also what citizens want. I mean, we were mentioning the Rutte government. I mean, Rutte had to resign, and then was voted in, the month after. So basically, people didn't give a shit about that scandal. Okay. On the other hand, caseworkers tend to err on the conservative side, generally speaking. Since they come from a social work background, actually being very lenient, and this might be good. I mean, for the beneficiary. But might detract from overall legitimacy of the system. So this is very complex when you have to advise policymakers. So what's your take on this?
Absolutely. I mean, the most critical segment is maybe the low segment, right? Because then you're outsourced to a different party. You're not in the care of the public employment agency anymore. And I would say that there are legitimate cases where people don't want to be bothered with further training, right? There are life situations where you can't deal with it, where it won't help you, where it is just not suitable at the moment. So having all the training and active labor market measures is not always the best thing. Being left alone is also something that can be of value. But I think that getting the categorization to have low chances per se had an impact on people. Not having a say in, or not being legitimately allowed to actually say, in my life situation, a training doesn't help me at the moment, because that would then mean that you might not be eligible anymore to the payments. That is a problem. So you can't say it yourself, because then you would get cuts in your payment, but a computer is supposed to make the suggestion that you're low. Even I find that a bit paternalistic, right? Not automatically is getting a measure a good thing. Clear.
Social investment is paternalistic, yet.
Well, I think there are studies that show that a good ratio of caseworkers to clients has very good outcomes in terms of bringing people back into the labor market. So this is an investment that empirically has good outcomes.
Before thanking again Doris for her talk and discussion, and before having access to the light lunch, I would like to remind you that the next Presso colloquium will be on Friday, the 10th of March, with the title Computers, Robots and Experiments. It will be a talk by Professor Viola Schiaffonati. She's a professor of philosophy of science from Politecnico di Milano. Now it's the time to thanks again, Doris.
Thank you.